Welcome, chess clubs, to our very first remote YouTube lesson. I hope that you all will enjoy this. I miss seeing your smiling faces, but that's the way that it is right now. I'd like to continue the lessons that we had started back when we were having chess club in person with tactics. Now you may recall we discussed discovered check. We discussed forks. Remember, forks is where one piece can attack more than one piece. We talked about forks in the road. Today we're going to talk about a chess tactic called a pin. Like the other chess tactics we've discussed, pins also attack two pieces at once. Now, what I have on the board is something that we talked about before, which was discovered check. Do you remember that you have the rook here looking past its own bishop at the king? If we move the bishop out of the way, then the rook is checking the king. We call this a discovered check. And when we move the bishop here, the bishop attacks the queen and the rook attacks the king. So the king must move out of check, which will allow the bishop to capture the queen. A pin is very much like a discovered check, but we just change it. We put this bishop here. Instead of the white bishop, we now have a black bishop. We say that this bishop is pinned because it cannot move. This bishop, if it moves to any square, the king would be in check. And by the rules of chess, you are not allowed to move into check. The word pin comes from things like, imagine I take this piece of cloth. I can pin it to the chessboard. I just take some clip. I just take a clip, and I take the clip I just dropped, and I pin it to the board. This cloth cannot move. The word pin actually comes from actual pins. Do you see this piece of styrofoam with all these pins in it? I take a pin. I can take a piece of cloth, and I can pin this little cloth pawn to the piece of cloth. You also talk about pins as keeping something from moving. You stop it from moving. This pawn can't move. This cloth can't move. If I take my daughter's friend Jimbo here, and I hold him up against my board, we would say I am pinning him against the board. And you do that in chess. You pin pieces to other pieces. You make it so they cannot move. In this instance here, the bishop is pinned to the king. It cannot move. Since it cannot move, that is going to allow the rook to take. So in just a minute, so we're going to see how we can use this tactic to gain material. Okay, I've reset the board here to a different position. This position you actually see quite often in chess. Do you notice that the white bishop is lined up with the knight, lined up with the queen? Any piece that moves in a straight line can pin another piece. A bishop can pin. A queen can pin. And we've noticed in the last example, a rook can also pin. A knight actually cannot pin another piece. It has to be a long-range piece, and it has to move in a straight line. Here, the bishop is pinning the knight to the queen. If the knight moves, say to attack the bishop, we take the queen. Simple as that, okay? So that's one way in which a piece can be pinned. Let me show you another way. Okay, here I've set up another position. It's another pin. The rook, a long-range piece that moves in a straight line, is pinning the knight. Now you might say, Coach Wendy, you forgot something. There's no piece that the knight is pinned to. That's an empty square. Now some of you may have seen this in the fork puzzles I sent home a couple weeks ago. you don't just need to attack a piece, you can also attack a critical empty square. So what this rook is doing, it is pinning the knight to this square here. Because if the knight moves, then the rook comes down, and that is checkmate. The rook is checking the king, protected by the bishop. The king cannot move here because that would be check. The king cannot move here because that would be checked by the bishop. It can't move here because that would still be checked by the rook. And the king cannot take the rook because it is protected by the bishop. So you can pin a piece to another piece. You can also pin a piece to an important checkmating square. Okay, so some of you may be wondering, what is the good of pinning? How do I win material through a pin? Pinning can work for two reasons. One is it helps you capture pieces. It also just helps you stop those pieces from moving so they can't be used. And we'll talk about that more later. Here we go. The rook is pinning the bishop to the king. Do you all see that? And the bishop can't move, but the rook cannot take the bishop because then the pawn would take the rook, and that would be no good for white. The bishop is worth 3 points. The rook is worth 5 points. That would not be a good trade. However, when you pin a piece, one of the powerful things you can do is attack that pinned piece. So if it's white to move, white can come up and attack the bishop. The bishop cannot move. So what can they do? They have to make a move. Say they move the king over, and then we get the bishop, and then the pawn takes the pawn, which is fine, and then the rook takes the pawn, and now we know that white is going to win, because a king and a rook can always win against just a king. I hope you've all practiced that king and rook checkmate pattern, because I want to work with you on that one-on-one over the next couple of weeks. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how pins might appear within the context of a chess game. For those of you who are playing tournaments, you will have seen these already. For those of you who've not, you are going to see them both in chess club when we get back together and play, and in tournaments. As you all know, E4, best by test. It helps release the queen, helps release the bishop. Very good. Oftentimes, this pawn comes out to meet it, controlling the center. So far, white and black playing really good moves. The next thing you do is you get out your knights and bishops. So white takes out this bishop, and maybe black takes out, black takes out this knight, white takes out this knight, and black takes out this knight. So far, so good. Now, white's going to also take out a knight. Black's going to also take out a knight. They want to get their bishops out. So maybe black brings out this bishop to here. Now, do you notice that this bishop is pinning this knight to this pawn? We've already got a pin in place. And white moves up that pawn, but now, with that move, white can release this bishop, but now the knight is pinned to the king. This is what we call an absolute pin. This knight absolutely cannot move, because if it moves, it's moving into check. Can't do that. That's an absolute pin. Okay? So black decides they're going to move here too, and white can't move their bishop out here to pin because they blocked with their pawn. Not so good. But they can move this bishop out and pin the knight to the queen. This is an absolute pin. This knight absolutely cannot move. This pin is a relative pin. This knight can move, it's just bad because they don't want to lose their queen. If this knight moves, the queen is lost. So, a relative pin, this knight can't move unless you want to lose your queen, but it can move. This knight absolutely cannot move because that would be breaking the rules of the game. So let's see if this bishop comes out. This is a relative pin. You see this all the time. So black now has both knights pinned. A relative pinning the knight to the queen, and an absolute pin pinning this knight to this king. So the question is, when you have something pinned, what should you do? How do you get at this? Well, one of the things that you do, let's just say for argument, it's white's turn, they're going to move here. When you pin a piece, you want to attack the pinned piece. So a good move for black would be to move their knight up to right here. Now this knight is attacked by the bishop and by the knight. And maybe white has forgotten that they are pinned. So they say, fine, your knight is here, I'm going to take your knight. And black says, great, boom, I've taken your queen. And that is how pins work in chess. Next time I will show you a wonderful Paul Morphy game, and you can see how the great Paul Morphy uses pins to make it so his opponent's pieces can barely move at all. Good luck practicing pins. I will be emailing a puzzle sheet for you guys to work on pins and try to look for them in your own games. See you next time.